Hi everyone, it's good to have you back for another chess lesson. So in previous lessons, we talked about how to set up the chessboard. We talked about how the pieces move, and we also showed some preliminary mating patterns. And what I'm going to do today to talk about some very basic chess tactics, okay? And those are forks, pins, and skewers. Okay, so let's start with forks. This one might be the most common that you have seen. So let me get us started there. Okay, so let me clear up the board here for a second. And then I'm going to just put a hypothetical position here in which white has a knight here, black has one rook here and another rook here. Okay, so this is a very basic form of a fork. So you might remember that knight moves like this and it also moves like this. So essentially what you have right now is two rooks that are under attack by the knight, and one of these rooks will have to go, right? So that would be fork. So this is essentially all a fork is a double attack. Okay, so it doesn't always have to be between two rooks. It could be between any two other pieces, but rooks are higher value than knights are. So that would be something that you usually want to have if you're white, for example, in this position. So let's put another position here. It doesn't have to be in the format that I showed. It can be like this because you can have each piece on one side of the board if you like. If you have an imaginary line here at the mid point of the board, you can have a fork that looks like this. Now, what is more powerful is if you have for example, a king here instead of a rook. And the reason this would be more powerful is that now here you can do the fork with a check, right? If the if the knight goes here, there's a check. Black will have to move this king. Let's say the king goes here. Now you can take this piece. You just got a rook for yourself, right? So now one thing you have to remember is that fork doesn't always have to be with the knight. It's any sort of double attack. So let's look at another hypothetical position here. Let's say that I have two pawns here and black has a bishop here and a knight here. If I play this, this would still be a fork. Now the pawn is attacking both the knight and the bishop. And so one of these two pieces will have to go. Black can move the bishop, go here, for example. Then you would take the knight with the pawn, and now you're just going to be a knight up, right? So it doesn't have to be with, remember, it doesn't have to be with the knight. It can be with the pawn. It can also be with the bishop, for example. Any sort of a double attack we're going to call a fork, okay? Now, let's think of an example of this in a game. You might have seen something like an opening that looks like this. Let's say white plays this and black goes here. And then white plays this, black goes here, and white goes bishop c4. Now, if I can move the bishop, if this bishop goes to c4, now black can play a quick trick here like this. Now, if you take the knight back, this move d5 here, and now you have a fork. So that's an example of a fork in a real game, right? Of course, white doesn't have to take the knight back here. A common move, for example, is once black takes here, then white can take here and give a check, and then take this back. It still might not be a great position for white because of two strong pawns at the center, even if the black cannot castle anymore. But anyway, so that's an example of a fork in an opening or in the middle of a game. Okay, so again, fork would be just a double attack. Now, let's go to our next example. The next one I want to talk about is a pin. Okay, so what is a pin? Let's say that you have a piece that is protecting a more valuable piece. For example, let's say that if I'm black, I have a knight here and a queen here, and white has a bishop here. And so let's say there are pawns here, but there's no pawn between this knight and this queen here, right? So here, this knight is in a pin, okay? The reason it is in a pin is that if it moves, then black will lose their queen, right? So if you are black, you essentially cannot move this knight until you do something with this pin situation, right? In this case, where I do not have a pawn also protecting my knight, I also cannot move the queen, because if I do that, then the knight will go, right? So this bishop will take the knight. So that's an example of a pin, right? Now, the reason that these pieces that are in a pin are so vulnerable is that, now if I take this bishop, this knight with the bishop, black can take it back with the queen, right? But let's say if I had a pawn here, then I could just take it with the pawn, or I could take it with the bishop, and the bishop would be protected, right? So this pawn here can be really powerful in terms of creating a pin and taking this piece away. Let's say what would make it even more powerful was if black had a king here instead of a queen, right? In that case, this piece would just go, right? The black cannot move this piece away. Whereas if there's a queen here, for example, let's say that let me set up a hypothetical position here. Let's say that black has also a bishop here, and white is right at the start of the game, so they haven't castled or anything. It's very early on in the game, and there are some other pieces, for example. So let's say this is the hypothetical position. White is bringing this pawn forward, wanting to take this piece. Black could, for example, take this pawn, give a check. Once white take the bishop, black could give another check, and when the king goes back, black can take this bishop, right? So even if this was a pin, black can move the piece and take the bishop that is causing this pin. However, none of this could have happened if instead of a queen here, I had a king. So let's say if queen was here and king was here, and the situation was like this, black could take here, white could take back, but then this knight could not move, because then you would be in check, right? So a pin is always more powerful for the opponent that is causing the pin. The pin is always more powerful if you're pinning a piece to the king as opposed to the queen or a rook, for example. Okay, so let's think of this also in a real game example. Let's see if I can reset the board. Let's say that you play the French defense, and the black plays the French defense if you're white, and white is going like this. And now white plays knight c3 to protect this pawn. Black comes knight f6, and white goes bishop g5. Okay, so you can probably already notice this pin here. Now black will have to do something about the pin. They could, for example, play bishop e7. That way they will not be in a pin. They've taken care of it, because you could bring this pawn forward and this would just go back, right? The knight could just go back to, the knight could just go back to d7, right? So, however, let's say that black doesn't play the right move. Let's say that black tries to protect this knight by playing knight b to d7. And now in this case, if you play e5, now you have put this knight in a pin, and you can then take away the knight on the next move, right? Of course, black can complicate things a little bit here. For example, they could go h6. Now they're attacking our piece also. And if you go back, they could play g5. And if you go here, then the knight can escape. For example, knight h5, right? However, they've just made a lot of moves to just get away out of this pin. One thing that if the pawn was not on h7, the situation would have been a whole lot different. So let's say, if I can move this knight, let's say that this is here, and this pawn is here, and this pawn is on h5 instead, and white is causing a pin here. So in this case, then black does not have a piece to complicate things. They cannot play h5 and h6 anymore because the pawn has already moved. And so now this piece is going to go, right? So that's an example of an easy pin happening on the queen, right? You can do another example. Let's say, no, of course, this is if black plays not great moves, right? Here in this example that I showed, black didn't play the best moves. Let's do another example in which black doesn't play the best moves. So this is e4, e5, knight f3 for white. Knight f3, black plays the Philidor defense, white goes to d4, and black plays knight c6. And now let's say that white is going to take this bishop to b5. The white bishop goes to b5, and now there's another pin here. This time the pin is on the king. In the previous example, the pin was on the queen. And so now, again, the right move would be for black to take care of this piece by playing bishop d7. That would take away the pin. But let's say, similar to our previous example, black plays this knight to e7. And now this time you can play d5, and then this piece is going to go away. Again, just like the previous example, if this pawn is here, black can complicate things a little bit with a6. But if this pawn wasn't here, if it was on a5, for example, then this piece would have been gone. Okay, so that's an example of a pin happening in the middle of a game, or actually in an opening in a game. So that's a pin. And the last example I want to give you today is the example of a skewer. A skewer is when you have two pieces that are typically on a diagonal. They don't have to be. Let's say that black has two rooks. One of them is here, the other one is here. And then white has a bishop on g3. Now this bishop on g3 is going to take away one of these two pieces, right? Black can move one of them, but they cannot move both. If they had a piece that they could put in front of them, that would be, so let's say that black has also a knight that they can put in here, and let's say that this knight is protected by this pawn here. So this would then be an example of a pin, because the knight would be pinned to the rook. However, in the absence of a piece here, then black would just lose one of the two rooks here. Now, maybe a good example of this that I can think of is if both opponents have brought their have castled and have brought their bishops to the b7 or g2 square. And let's say in this case, black has exchanged a bishop, but white has their bishop right here. You might have seen openings that look like this. Now, let's say that black has a queen here. Now, this is an example of another pin. And if there is nothing else in between and there is nothing else black can do at the rest of the board, then this queen will be gone, because the queen cannot move. It is actually, this is an example of a pin also. It cannot move, and then you will have you will take the queen away, essentially, right? Let's say let's dramatize this a little bit. Let's say that we are in a situation like this. And so in this situation, black has a queen and 3 pawns. White has a rook, a bishop, and 2 pawns. So black has some material advantage. But if it is white to move, white can give a check. Black would have to come up. And if black comes to b7 now, bishop g2 will take away the queen. So this might be a better example for a pin than it is for a skewer, but you kind of get the idea. Now, another way you can see a square play out is, let's say white is trying to bring a pawn here to the end of the board. And if this pawn gets here, it will be promoted. And black would like to prevent that. So let's say white's king is here, and black has a rook here. Now, black could not go back to the end. Black could not go down here and try to prevent this, because if black goes to d8, then pawn will just take this rook and will be promoted at the same time, right? One thing black can do is wait for white to get here and then promote this knight to this pawn to, let's say, a queen, and then do a skewer. Now these two are in the same line of attack. If the king moves, let's say here, black can take this back, and now it will be a draw. So this kind of skewer can happen a lot in endgames, especially when you have a position like this where you are trying to promote a piece, and your opponent can use a skewer to take advantage of these checks here. It can also happen if both opponents are trying to promote pieces, right? So here, if it's black's turn, they could promote first. Let's say white has a king that is here. If black can promote first, and let's say they turn this into a rook, if white promotes and turns this to a queen, then black can give a check here, and then once this moves, black can take the queen. Okay, so that's an example of a skewer. It's two pieces being in the same line of attack, and in this case, you will see that essentially the rook can give a check and take the queen here with this check. Okay, so just a quick review of everything we discussed. So the first example was a fork. This is an example of where you have a knight, and the knight could attack two pieces. Let's say you have a king and a queen. The knight will give a check to the king will have to move, then the knight can take the queen. This doesn't have to be with a knight, it can be with other pieces as well. Pawns, I showed an example of that can be really powerful. The second example is that of a pin, where you have, let's say you have a king here, and let's change it up a little bit. Let's just go back to what I had. Let's say you have a knight here and a bishop here, and now this is a pin. If there's nothing else, white can attack this knight if there's nothing else protecting it. If there is something protecting it, maybe white could try to move a pawn to take this knight. And that would be an example of a pin happening here on this diagonal. And finally, the example of a skewer, where you can have a pawn, for example, going toward the end of the board to get the promotion, and black could then just give a check if, let's say, if the pawn is promoted into a queen, and black can give a check here, and then once white moves, black can take this queen here. Okay, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions or if there are other topics you want me to talk about, please let me know in the comments section. See you all again soon. Thank you.